All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Winning Momentum Podcast, episode 186 with your host. That's me, Scott Sinclair. How has your week been? It is Thursday, February 3rd. I missed you last week. I was traveling, a little under the weather, didn't have my equipment with me. There was a tornado, a flood, a hurricane. That's a Blues Brothers reference. Was it Blues Brothers? Blues Brothers reference for those of you not of my age group, the Winning Momentum Podcast. Now, we're still playing with equipment. I'm still playing with equipment as we move into this new format and exit the Martinis with Scott show. I did for a couple of years, but I think we're getting close. Got my new mic stand in today. How do you like it? Hopefully the sound is amazing and a little more stable than it used to be. I want to talk to you today about crisis communication. You have a crisis in your life, a crisis in your business, a heated situation. What's the best way to try to communicate, to persuade, and to be effective to fix the problem? This is, again, in business, in life, doesn't matter. What if you have in your business, you have an angry customer? Right? You haven't fulfilled your obligations, or you're perceived not to have fulfilled your obligations. You have an angry supplier, a new employee, or an angry employee who, their expectations of this role was not what they thought it was going to be, a negative media campaign. Think about the news this week of CNN and Zucker leaving over sexual allegations. What if there's a negative media campaign coming at your company? Angry stakeholders. I'm thinking of the Canadian truckers this week and, a segment of the population in Canada and around the world that are expressing their views about the Canadian government, restrictions in lockdowns and mandates and all these sorts of things, right? There's a segment of your population, a stakeholder group that are angry. How do you communicate with them in this crisis? What if you're in your personal life, you have a partner or a family member that is angry with you, thinks you've done something that you shouldn't have done, rightly or wrongly? How do you communicate? How do you deal with that situation? You've got trouble. Let me try one of my. Here we go. You've got trouble with a stakeholder. Okay, that didn't work. I tried to hit the wah, wah, wah button. Oh, it's turned down. That's why. We are learning our technology. As I said, this is really a beta show. All right. Okay, there's a formula. There's a formula that you can think about in this situation for effective and persuasive communications to deal with crisis or to deal with a heated situation. It's not a silver bullet. It is never silver bullet. If turnarounds, if crisis management was easy, if it was guaranteed, everybody would be doing it. It's not a silver bullet, but it is, in my experience, very persuasive and effective. Here is the formula. Are you ready? Here's the formula. It's 3 items. Number 1, the first thing you do, reframe. Second thing you do is you show empathy. And the third thing you do is you commit to action. Reframe, empathy, action. Reframe, empathy, action. Can I do myself? I need a producer for these things. All right, I'm having fun with this Rodecaster Pro. If you're in the podcast business or trying to learn the podcast business, get one of these Rodecaster Pros. This thing is amazing, and if I learn how to use it, it'll be a little more seamless. All right, reframe, empathy, action. Let's talk about this. Let's give you some actual examples. How about Apple? Apple Inc., I think they are. Apple, there used to be Apple Computers. Back in 2011, for those of you that can think back that far, Apple released to great fanfare its new iPhone 4. And this turned into a crisis, and it's the first time that I really understood this formula, which is why I wanted to tell you this story. It released its iPhone 4, and it had its usual incredible success. People were lining up at the retailers to go buy this thing. I don't remember back in 2011 whether there were Apple stores. I think they were, but people were lining up the night before, as usual, with new Apple product launches to get the new iPhone 4. It was a smartphone revolution. It had a new and improved display. It was resolution-wise. It was the thinnest iPhone in the world at the time. It had new introduced multitasking capabilities, and the new FaceTime app had been introduced with the iPhone 4. FaceTime, which we rely on for family communications to this day. Basically 11 years later. Huge success, this product launch. Apple had sold over 600,000 units in pre-orders in the first 24 hours. 600,000 units in pre-orders in the first 24 hours. And of course, I don't remember the price tag back then, but it would have been the most expensive smartphone on the market. Certainly, always the Apple products are very, very pricey. And so great success on the launch. But shortly after the launch, a crisis began that, had it been allowed to brew and to grow, would have had permanent, or had the potential anyways, for permanent negative branding implications for Apple. So what was the problem? The users were complaining. The users of this iPhone 4 were this very expensive phone, the most advanced smartphone on the market, couldn't make phone calls because the reception on this thing sucked. The antenna sucked. I think the antenna was really the steel casing within the phone itself. And what was worse is if you held the phone, this handheld device, if you held that in your hand, if you held your handheld device in your hand, it would kind of cover up the antenna and you'd lose all reception altogether and the call would drop, right? I mean, how horrible is that for Apple, which had a brand, still has a brand for being the world leaders in design and engineering within its product lines, right? And so this became a significant crisis. And because it was so counter to the built-up Apple brand, the media just went to town on this. It was on all the tech magazines. It got into mainstream media. And there even became a word for this crisis, which was Antennagate. And so this grew, and it became a significant issue for Apple. No one wanted anything to do with this phone. So at the time, the Apple CEO was the iconic leader, Steve Jobs, extraordinarily persuasive and effective CEO. And he did a over 30-minute live presentation address to customers and to the media. So he was on stage. It opened up with a music video, and he gave a 30-minute address on this issue. And weeks later, when the dust had settled and when experts were looking back and said, hey, what happened to that crisis with Apple? It became recognized that this was probably the best crisis management response in the history of corporate, in the history of business, that this was so well handled, it became the textbook for how to handle this situation. Certainly the first time I became aware of the formula that I'm presenting to you today: reframe, empathy, action. So what did Jobs say in the presentation? Goal number one, reframe the issue, right? That's the reframe. Reframe means that there's a narrative going on in this heated situation, in this crisis that you have, and the narrative is something negative, and you want to change it to a different narrative, right? And so what he said was, here's what you're saying about our iPhone 4, but what I want you to know is that all smartphones have problems. All smartphones, not just the Apple, all smartphones have problems. And then he proceeded to give a number of examples with the competitor smartphones and the problems that they were having. Many of them were reception problems along the same lines. And so all smartphones have problems was the reframing. It wasn't this iPhone 4 doesn't receive a call and has no reception. It was all smartphones, including our competitors, have problems. And he gave a bunch of data, to say that the reception issues with the iPhone 4 were overstated, but he gave a bunch of data about here's problems with my competitors' phones. And the result of that, by the way, I think that was backed up by the Apple promotions media people pre-canning stories about problems with a Samsung or problems with a BlackBerry back then, getting those out to the media so that the result was the next day, the media focus was entirely on the problems with the Samsung, the problems with the RIM product, with the BlackBerry products. And nobody was talking about Applegate anymore. It completely changed the storyline because it had been reframed and the narrative was different. So that was the impact of how he started the presentation, the address to the media and the world at large, was by reframing the situation. And then what he said was, and this is a direct quote from his speech, was that we care about every user. We want every user to be happy. We care about every user and we want every user to be happy. So here's a bunch of information to prove that the reception issue, antenna gate, is being overblown. Changed the storyline, reframed it to be that every smartphone, every single smartphone, including all of our competitors, or especially all of our competitors, have problems, but empathy, I understand, and we want every user to be happy, which led him to promised action. And the action, he said that Apple couldn't be satisfied. We cannot be satisfied with this, and we commit to work every day and night on finding a solution. And since we don't yet have a solution to this issue, since we haven't made you happy yet, and we want every user to be happy, Apple said it would offer every one of their customers a free iPhone 4 case, okay? Which also had the added benefit, as I recall, when you get the case, now you're not hanging on to the steel case more or less directly, and so it gave some reception advantages to it, okay? Reframed it, showed empathy, we want you to be happy, and promise an action. And if you use that formula, it can be very effective and it can be very persuasive. And there is an excellent textbook example from Steve Jobs as to how to apply that formula. And what happened to the Apple brand? Was it damaged? No. It just became common knowledge that all smartphones have problems, which is how it was reframed, and that Apple were the ones that cared and were fixing it. All of a sudden they went from the bad guys to the good guys based on this one 30-minute address from the CEO. So that's probably the best corporate response to a crisis ever. Last week, I'll give you another example. Last week, if we've been paying attention to the news, Joe Rogan and the Joe Rogan Experience, I believe, is the name of his podcast, a world-beating podcast with over 200 million monthly downloads from Spotify, which I believe to be one of the top, or the top, makes him one of the top media listened people in the world. And for those that don't know and don't listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, every episode is like 3-4 hours long. And so you've got 200 million downloads of an average of, let's call it 3 hours of content. It's a crazy amount of content, crazy popular and influential podcast. And I believe that the 200 million downloads a year or two ago was actually 300 million downloads before he switched from all platforms to exclusively Spotify, who paid him a bunch of money to do that. And so Rogan came into hot water, started by Neil Young and then followed up by other old rock, folky type musicians. Joni Mitchell joined it. And what Neil said was Spotify can have Rogan or they can have Young, but they can't have both. And the concern expressed, apart from getting a bunch of attention when you're 80 odd years old, the concern expressed was that Rogan is spreading misinformation on his podcast. He's spreading misinformation by interviewing doctors or certain professionals that have an opinion and interpret data or science that is counter to the conventional. In particular, of course, we're all talking about the global pandemic at the moment. So he had a doctor on there whose name Dr. Malone, I think his name was on there, and everybody was upset that this doctor has a different opinion from the generally accepted media-driven science and government-driven science of the day. Okay, so he has a different opinion. Rogan has them on the show and they talk for 3-4 hours. Now, for those that never have listened to the Rogan podcast, you got to know that this is a guy who sits for 3-4 hours interviewing people. He's super smart. He doesn't he argues with them, but he asks the questions that you would want to ask, challenges from a layman's perspective. But what about this? But I read that. What do you think about this? And he does all that very often while smoking about a yard of weed and drinking whiskey and getting incredibly high and sometimes just turning into gibberish. That's what that show is. It's incredibly entertainment. Joe Rogan's a great entertainer, a comedian by trade, has had lots of TV time, and it's usually a very, very interesting conversation. Okay, but he's being attacked, and the mainstream media and the social media got a hold of this movement last week, and they're all over Spotify to get rid of Joe Rogan. And Spotify, of course, paid him $100 million up front, I believe, plus a whole bunch of money per episode. So they're not really, I think, interested in getting rid of Rogan. We shall see, but they were happy enough to get rid of Neil Young and I think Joni Mitchell. They got rid of them off the platform in response to their requests. So the pressure's building on Rogan, and he puts out a 10-minute video in response to all of this. And what did he do? It was a terrific video. Number one, reframe. He started off by saying, look, this podcast is not intended to provide news, and it's not intended to provide information. That's not what this is. Go to the news. Go to the government sources. Go to wherever you want to go, somewhere else, to get news and information. We're not here to spread misinformation. This podcast is about me, Joe Rogan, having a conversation that I find interesting. That's how this started. That is the history of the show, and that's what this is about. It's about me having a conversation that I find interesting, and as it turns out, a whole bunch of other people find that conversation interesting as well, and so they listen in, and that's it. It's not about providing information. It's about an interesting conversation. And do I make mistakes? He said, sure. I make lots of mistakes, but then I work hard to try to fix them, to understand the issue better, because it's an interesting conversation to me. I like to understand issues, and then he digs into it, and he does, in fact, do research. Often he has an expert in, and if you haven't seen the show, because it's such a huge show, they have a level of production on the spot, unlike me, who's got to figure out how to use my own Roadcaster. And, they Google things, and they research things right there. An expert says something, well, there's a claim that 7 million children a year die from air pollution, air particle issues within their home, which was something I heard on the Rogan podcast with Jordan Peterson as I was commuting yesterday. And he just says, stop, wait a minute, let's look that up right now, because that just seems outrageous to me. And they looked it up, and it wasn't quite true. It was sort of true, but Peterson was a little off in his information, and they corrected it right on the spot. He says, so I make mistakes, but then I try to correct them. So there's the reframe. The reframe is, I'm not trying to give you information. I'm trying to have an interesting conversation, and you get to sit in should you want to find that conversation interesting as well. And when I make mistakes or have something wrong in the issue, well, I try to fix it, right? And so there's the reframe. Then what did he do? Then he moved into empathy. Reframe, empathy, action. So the empathy was, I've told you this is about an interesting conversation, but I don't want you to take this as information or misinformation. And the quote was, if I've pissed you off, I'm sorry. It says, if I've pissed you off, I'm sorry. He showed some understanding and some sympathy towards those that were questioning the podcast or accusing him of providing misinformation. And then he moved into action, and he gave 2 action items. There was actually 3 action items. The first one was in the reframing itself, where he says, look, I try to learn from my mistakes. I make lots of mistakes. I try to dig deeper into the issue and correct my mistakes. Then he said, Spotify is going to put a warning label on contentious experts on the episodes that I have a discussion with experts that people believe to be contentious. And I support that, he said. I want them to put a warning label on, so that's what they're going to do. There's an action item. And the second action item that he said was, in the future, if he has a controversial guest, he's going to bring in, perhaps in the next show or really close to the show that they just did, he's going to bring in a conventional thinking expert and do an interview with them, so you can get the balance. You can get both sides of the story. And that is his proposed action plan: reframe, empathy, action. I thought his response was excellent. Now, as I said, this is not a silver bullet. Is that going to satisfy Neil Young? Is that going to satisfy the people on The View? Obviously not, because they're not really concerned about this situation. They're getting attention for themselves and trying to drive up their relevance in the world. So we'll see. We'll see what this does for Joe Rogan's reputation, for Spotify, and how it plays out. But regardless, I thought the response was terrific and a learning lesson for us on the Winning Momentum podcast, where we try to learn about how to deal with troubled situations. All right. Hey, when's the last time you used an extension ladder? Do you remember that? I can't think. I've got a worker outside of my office right now doing some painting on an extension ladder. Maybe you need, maybe you're on a ladder to rescue a toy off a roof, or you had to paint the trim around the window, or clean the gutters, or do some painting, as my fellow out here is doing. And you know the routine. You strategically try to find the best place to position the ladder, but still you end up scratching or denting the gutter on the outside of your house. And when you finally pluck up the courage to grip that ladder tight and pray that it doesn't wiggle, and you try desperately to push through the thoughts of falling on your head. You want to talk about misinformation? I'm going to get this wrong, but I think the stats are that in the U.S., 600,000 people a year go to the hospital from ladder accidents. It's insane. It's a crazy dangerous thing to do, statistically speaking, when you're climbing a ladder domestically at your house. And this is the old way to climb a ladder, and it is the reason that we at Roofers World invented the ladder mount. I should have grabbed one. I should have always grabbed one for you here when I'm reading someone's product script. This is a one-of-a-kind gutter guard, slaps easily into place using a broom pole from the safety of the ground. The ladder mount is designed to fit standard gutters and can easily be placed over the gutter brackets. You'll notice the difference as soon as you begin to climb. Ladder mounts provide stable base for your ladder and give you the confidence to climb safely. Home do-it-yourselfers love the ladder mount because it gives them the peace of mind when climbing a ladder. Ladder mount will save you hundreds of dollars by protecting your expensive gutters. Ladder mount. Ask for it by name at your favorite do-it-yourself store and paint stores, or order online at roofersworld.com. Roofersworld.com or roofersworldstore.com. I'm certain that you can go to either one of those. All right. What have we been talking about? Reframe, empathy, action. Let me give you one example of how maybe not to deal with this, or to things that could have been done different. We're experiencing this week and last week, the Canadian truckers have mobilized and moved to Ottawa, Canada, which for you international listeners may not know is the capital city of Canada. It's kind of like going to Washington, D.C. in the U.S., and you had what was reported to be about 50,000 big rig 18-wheeler trucks in a convoy from all over the nation, descending into the city of Ottawa, which is a city of about 1 million people, where the Parliament buildings are. Very beautiful city. And then a bunch of other people jumped on the bandwagon. So you had 100,000, 200,000 people, downtown core, all protesting restrictions, mandates, mask usage, everything that pisses people off about the current pandemic situation. And I'm not taking a side. I'm not saying I agree with them, or I'm not saying I disagree with them. Okay, that's not what this is about. This is about how do you respond to the crisis, okay? Now, let's talk about how Canadian leadership has responded to this. And I need you to suspend reality for a minute, and I need you to assume that you're the leader of Canada and that you give a shit, okay? Because there's no evidence that the leader of Canada, Justin Trudeau, does care or give a shit about these people. I mean, how long has this guy been prime minister? I'm not even sure. Maybe 8 years. I think he's going on to 8 years, something along those lines. He's won every election. He's led the country, and he's done that by what's the right word? Disrespecting, accusing, marginalizing this segment of the population. That's how he's won. That's been his playbook from day one. I don't think there's any evidence that Trudeau cares about the people on the ground protesting right now, or the people like them, right? Or the people like them on the ground. It's like if you're in the U.S., ask yourself whether the Biden administration truly cares about blue-collar workers in Cleveland or minority neighborhoods. And if you look at what their policies do to those constituents, you got to wonder if there's any empathy or caring whatsoever coming out of the government. And so, again, I'm not trying to take sides on this at all. I'm just saying, for the purposes of discussion, pretend you're Justin Trudeau and pretend you actually care. Pretend you care about these people and about being a leader. Well, you would want to persuade them, because this, if you cared, this is a crisis. Okay? I mean, it's very much a crisis. It's been going on for, I think, 5 days now. I actually just hung up with our legal counsel in Ottawa before I jumped on to shoot this show. And these poor people, the actual people that live in Ottawa, have to live downtown. There's been nonstop air horn honking from the, I shouldn't laugh, it's terrible, from the big trucks. Nobody's been sleeping. It's been a real hardship on the city, that is for sure. Okay, if you're Trudeau and you care, how might you use this formula? Reframe, empathize, action. Well, you could do, hypothetically, you could say something like this. You could say, you could address all of the protesters in some way on TV, or if you were brave enough to go outside and give a speech that would then be carried on TV. You could say, look, we had this global pandemic, and it has resulted in X number of deaths and lots of fear, evolving threats that nobody knew, or still nobody knows quite how to most effectively deal with that. But let's look at the actual data within Canada. Let's look at the data and let's compare it to some other jurisdictions. What you're going to find is that we are doing way better. We're doing way better on deaths and hospitalizations. And the reason for that is because we prioritized protection from the virus over freedom. That's what we did. As a leadership, we made a choice. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how bad it's going to be. Let's protect our citizens. Let's protect the most vulnerable. Let's protect our children from the virus. And we know that there's a sacrifice. We knew that there was a sacrifice of freedoms when we did that. And I'm not saying that we got every decision right. But we made a choice, and look at the data. Look at how bad they did in the U.S. Look at how bad they've done in these other places, and we've done better. That's just a fact. But we didn't get everything right because this is a war, and there's lots of unknown, and shit happens. We don't know the right answer to everything, but you move forward, and you do your best, and you evolve, and you correct your mistakes as you go. Based on our priorities, this has been a success. Based on the priorities we laid out, this has been a success. Look at the data. That's a reframing of this discussion, okay? That could be a great response to this. Move on to empathy. Notwithstanding, we recognize that because we prioritize the safety to the virus, okay, because that was our priority, there's a tremendous cost to every decision we make. And we've caused these problems, and the costs have manifested themselves in mental health. They've manifested themselves in child development problems, substance abuse, income security fears, just general fear. And a really bad one is mistrust. We've just generated a mistrust of our governmental and other institutions by making the decisions that we made. We understand that. Okay, we prioritized one terrible problem and caused some other problems. We understand that, okay? But that was the decision we made, and look at the data, it's worked out well. But I understand your concern because we know that we've done that. We agree with you. And we want you to trust in public institutions, because if you don't trust in the government, if you don't trust in public institutions, how are we ever going to tackle any problems ever? So we understand that it's our job to get you back on side and believing in your government and your institutions. Here's the action we're going to take to do that. Okay. So you reframed it, you empathize, and now you outline some action. We're not making any changes today, okay? But what we will do is a better job at communicating the criteria that we will be using, the benchmarks that we have to hit to start reversing all restrictions. We're going to set a timeline. We're going to say, when we see hospitalizations hit X, when we see deaths hit X, whatever that may be, we're going to start, here's the actions. We're going to start reversing whatever it is, mass lockdowns, children having to do whatever. We're going to reverse all that. And as long as nothing else happens, like a new variant that wipes us all out, we're going to stick to that, and we're going to communicate to you. We will lay out the plan to exit from this crisis. We will lay out a plan that you can monitor and understand to exit from this crisis. That will be our action. Thank you for coming here and protesting. Thank you for making your voices heard. Go home. Go home. That is using the formula, in my view, to respond to this sort of crisis, assuming you cared about these constituents, right? Would that be persuasive? I know a lot of you that listen agree with the truckers. Okay, I know a lot of you that listen don't agree with the truckers. I know who you are. But would that be persuasive? Again, we're not trying to be, in that scenario, persuasive with the people that already agree with you, that think that the truckers are terrible people. You're trying to be persuasive with the truckers and the people that support them. Would that sort of message be persuasive? I think that it would. Now, I asked you to suspend belief, right? And come up with the message using the formula, the crisis response using the formula that we just did. Now, what is the reality? Is the reality that that is what Canadian leadership and Justin Trudeau did? No, that is not reality. What he did is he first disappeared, right? He said, he just went to an undisclosed location. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, maybe that was just an announcement. But if you're not Canadian, you might not know that the Prime Minister lives at an address of 24 Sussex, which is, you could basically walk from there, a longer walk, maybe a mile and a half, 2 miles, to the Parliament buildings. And of course, the Prime Minister doesn't walk, he takes his motorcade. But bottom line is, he's close to downtown where the protests are. And so he took off. That was his first action, is he went and hid and didn't have any response. And then when he did have a response, he accused the protesters of being racist, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, transphobic, and also the media accused them of being Russian operatives. Okay, that was the response. Now, how do you think calling someone transphobic or a Russian operative is going to be in terms of persuasion, to getting them on side? Do you think that'd be persuasive and effective? Or do you think that's just going to harden positions and drag out this situation, right? I think the answer to that is obvious. Now, that accusing them of being transphobic and having that aggressive negative response is great for your base, right? For the people that already hate these people that are protesting, you go, yeah, Trudeau, you really got it. I don't know any of those people, but you can imagine that if he's speaking to his own bubble, that works really well. And I come back to remind you that he's won all the elections doing exactly that. He's always demonized these people, and that seems to be his thing that works for him. But if you cared, and if you wanted to be persuasive, and if you wanted to put an end to this, obviously such a stupid amount of messaging. All right, I had something else to talk to you about today, but we're already 30 minutes into this thing, and I'm trying to keep them a little bit shorter without interviews. What I mean by that is when we have interviews, we'll go back to the hour format. So I think I'm going to call it a day on this. Do I deserve an applaud? Yeah, let's do that. Thank you for listening. I'll probably have a show next week. I'm not 100% sure. I'm in Vegas at a trade show. Ooh, excited about that. I hate trade shows, but it's fun to get out of town and do some traveling and pretend things are normal again. Thanks for listening. Hopefully, we will talk to you next week. This has been the Winning Momentum Podcast with me, Scott Sinclair.